I first picked up a camera when I was 16, and it was on a family trip to Hawaii. And it was one of those old like Sony CyberShot cameras. And I fell in love with it for about 10 years between Laguna Beach, California, and Los Angeles, where I was living. I was working with some of the top fashion brands, a lot of the top modeling agencies between New York and Los Angeles. And I really enjoyed it. I jumped into it really fast, and I think I was kind of led by the money aspect of it, coming from a small town childhood, and kind of went off course and realized that there was much more to this world than myself. I needed to focus more of my attention on photographing people that have stories like you and I. Not to say that models don't, but I think you know where I'm going with, like, substance comes from more, you know, interesting people like the people that you're viewing here. I did that for about 10 years, and overnight I decided that I wanted to kind of cold turkey. I quit all my contracts with my clients and agents, and I just decided I'm 30 years old, I've grown up in California my whole life, I want to move on and do something new.
So it's 2020, and as you mentioned, everyone's life changed in 2020, and you decided to visit your childhood friend in North Carolina and pack up what you had to visit, and then eventually move in with Dan and his wife, and then what happens?
So the trip that I spent was a month and a half, and I basically jumped north to Montana from California. I was basically like camping on the side of my car, fishing for dinner, kind of just living off the land, working on different outfits of cowboy ranches that I have a little bit of a background in. I fell in love with what started this whole journey was actually photographing cowboys. And I think that there was something real about it. It was meeting up with these people and their families from all different backgrounds all over the US and working with livestock that I really appreciated, kind of that small town living. The people that had, you know, dirt in their teeth and dust on their face and just had so much going for them. When I went to North Carolina, I moved in with Dan and his wife temporarily. And I was living in like their upstairs spare bedroom right next to their little boy's room. And Dan and I started talking because I told him that I just shot like 400 images on this trip, and it's all on film from this camera. And I want to create a photo book for my travels and have stories in there about the different landscapes, the different cowboys that I was photographing. And I wanted to give the proceeds of that book towards a veteran organization of Dan's choice. And Dan kind of went up to me and was like, you know, I separated myself from 6 years in the service and had a very hard transition. I gave up kind of all my military experience. I didn't tell any of my coworkers or people in college that I served, but I've been wanting to give back more. Why don't we do a photo book on veterans instead? And that's where the idea of the 20-year war came about, was in Dan's living room of us sitting down one night speaking about how we wanted to do this book. But in order to do it, this was towards the end of 2020. And we knew that coming up was going to be the 20th anniversary of 9/11 in 2021. So we kind of had to jump on the idea really quick. And I know we'll get into it, and we'll bring Tom, our third co-author, into this too.
Tell everyone a little more about Dan and Tom,
Sure.
and then we'll talk about
So
the book.
when Dan and Tom were both in the 2nd Battalion Army Rangers, so 275, they didn't serve together. They were at different wavelengths and different years of service. But when they both got out, they went to the National Guard. And so that's where Dan and Tom met. And when I moved in with Dan, we started talking about who do you know in the service? Who can we kind of create a Rolodex of contacts to create this book? Because we need to figure out, our goal at the time was about 50 veterans that we want to feature in the book. And we need to kind of figure out, we need all 4 branches. You know, we need to figure out everybody from each part of the service from the 20 years. So Dan contacted Tom, who he was still in touch with. And Tom was kind of the connector of, you know, us and the museum here. And it was with Bill Butler that he sent the first email draft. And I remember he always talks about the story, but he was so excited about the idea of the book. And Tom is usually like the crusher of hopes and dreams. Like if you come to him with an idea, he's like, that sounds stupid, it's been done, let's not do it. We came to him about the book and he's like, yeah, that sounds awesome. Like I haven't seen a book that talks about transition and veterans and their current daily lives rather than just a combat story. So we started talking, and Bill Butler, you know, got excited about the idea, and I came up here to Columbus to meet with him and General Ferreter, and that's when we kind of sat down and discussed, you know, how can we take this book and kind of work together have the book release here. And basically they told me, okay, this is a great idea, but you need to do the work. So go out and find the veterans. We can help you with what we have here. And so during that time, I think it was around the end of December of 2020, going into January. And when we got a publisher on board, we had 4 months to do the book. So I basically told Dan at the beginning of January, I'm going to take a road trip for about almost 2 months. And I'll come home in the last 2 months, I'll sit down 12 hours a day behind the computer and I'll edit the whole book. So I drove across 42 states, 16,000 miles in a span of just less than 2 months and ended up photographing 71 veterans. So it went from 50 to 71 and
On this camera.
on this camera. And the funny story is like a week before I left, we had 6 veterans signed up for this trip. And logistically speaking, financially wise, I was like, it's not that 6 veterans aren't worth it, but it's gonna be very tough to do a 2-month trip and only have 6 veterans. So during the whole trip, Dan was kind of communicating with different people and was calling me up and being like, hey, are you on your way to Minnesota? I have a veteran there that's 2 hours away from where you are now. So it was kind of this hectic daily conversation of he was relaying information to me, and then I was meeting up with these people and their families to photograph them either at their homes or their business or doing something that they enjoy.
So we announced it on 9/11 that we were going to turn this into a photography exhibition. We didn't know what it was going to look like. We had 71 great stories to tell, wonderful photographs, and we'll talk a little about how this room is set up. But that was about the start of it. So we spent from really early September through March 12th or March 11th at 10:30 at night getting this ready for the public, and it debuted here on March 12th, 6 weeks ago or so.
Yeah, well, we kind of went into it thinking, you know, whoever we get connections to that has a story that's willing to share it, those are the veterans. So out of the 71, we didn't cut out anybody. So we didn't have like 90 and we brought down to 71, it was 71. So every veteran that I met up with, it was important to me to not waste their time, that their story is meant to be shared. And that's not even a scratch in the surface of how many veterans have served in our country that deserve to have their stories told. But the way we put it together is when I got home, you know, I spent, like I said, every day behind the computer. I designed front to back, the cover, the insides, all the different stories. But Tom is the author of one of the authors, so he did all the stories. When I was meeting with veterans, I was recording their story on my phone, and I would send that in a file to Tom, who would then translate that. I got to give him a ton of credit because I'm not a writer, and I enjoy writing, but my English is horrible with it. So he did a great job with it, and he worked with our editor really hard. But to fit a 224-page book in less than 4 months is just kind of unheard of. We had other publishers that were like, there's no way you're going to get it done. And I quickly learned, and I'm sure Colonel Bill Butler will agree, that when you're working with 2 Army Rangers and you tell them you can't do something in 4 months, they're like, watch, we're going to figure it out. The 20th anniversary, we decided to pick 20 veterans because truly all 71 have unique stories, but to represent the 20 people of all different backgrounds, of all different branches, it helps kind of solidify how powerful that 20-year war was to all of us.
But to Beau's point, every story in that of those 71 veterans is amazing, which is why the book was such an easy thing to translate into a photography exhibition. The tough part was, which stories do we want to feature as the 20 stories? Because there's more than 20 veterans on the walls here. We kind of focused in on 3 themes that, Beau, I want you to talk a little bit about with the group about those themes, because some of that comes out in some of these photographs, and we'll talk about that in a little bit once we go in depth of some of these people. But what were those 3 themes that we all kind of came up with?
So I believe we came up with transition, wellness, and what was the physical?
Leadership was the third one. Yeah.
So we focused on those 3 to kind of differentiate the different veterans that have either they run organizations or they do different kind of businesses relating to, you know, mental growth or wellness within their community. And that was kind of the deciding factor for the 20 veterans that you see. But we wanted to make sure that they have a voice for almost every veteran, that we're not kind of picking the same group of people. And that's kind of what we went about. And I know in a second I'll kind of get up and we'll highlight about 6 of them that I'll talk about, just personal stories that I shared with each of these people. I'm going to start on this first wall over here. So John Rodriguez here on the far right. I met with him in New York City. For those of you that have been after 9/11, so that is taken at the memorial. interesting story about J-Rod is that when he was in high school, he saw the towers get blown up. He's from New York City. He now works for NYPD, but he has never been back to the memorial because it was such a sensitive kind of topic for him. To me, I can't really imagine what that's like. I can't imagine you still living in New York, and when the Freedom Tower goes up and they have the memorial pools, how you just don't have a chance to go see it. But actually seeing him there and seeing kind of the emotion on his face and talking with him as I took his portrait, you could kind of see that he was interested in talking to me, but he was just kind of looking around. And I think we spent a few hours there going through the memorial pools, looking at all the names, walking around the corner of that old church that they actually rebuilt a little bit of a portion of it that went down. And that was just kind of a really interesting, kind of a more sentimental portrait. And it was cold. I mean, for most of this trip, like I said, I traveled in January. So most people don't go north in the winter. I went all the way to Houghton, Michigan, or Minnesota, and it was like below freezing up there. And this was kind of the first leg of the trip. I went up there, and then I came back down through Columbus. And then the second portrait that I really remember was Tanya Oxendine. So this woman here on the far left, she was running a organization, was working for MVP, which is Merging Vets and Players. So what the organization does is they're based out of Los Angeles, but they have different chapters throughout the United States. They basically pair up professional athletes with veterans. So they do a lot of it's mostly physical workout, so it's a lot of that physical wellness. And when I met with her, it was just outside of Atlanta, where she was living at the time. And it was actually raining that day like it was here today. And it was funny because I remember sitting in her home, and she had this beautiful home there, and I pulled her outside because I saw this big kind of green tree that was, just dripping with the water, and I took her photo there. But the story she shared, she was so charismatic, and it was definitely one of the women that I photographed that really kind of just stuck with me. And then if I move on down to this side, the two sisters here, Katie and Christine. So what I really love about this portrait here is the one who has the mean face, still you can tell has the officer written all over her. She's still in uniform. She was basically active, I think, that day, and was able to take a break and come meet up with me. But you almost see kind of the sensitive with Christine, and she just told me this when we released this exhibit, but she was pregnant at the time, and we had no idea. But it's kind of interesting that she has that natural mother instinct of having her arms crossed, and it just has this unique kind of composition of the two sisters that grew up together, and both, were officers in the Army, and Katie is actually General Votel's aide, so she's kind of on the high up side, and that was taken just outside of Fort Bragg in North Carolina. So I'll just give a quick example. It's not one of the main veterans, but this one here, David Prince, was the very first veteran that I photographed for the book, and that was just outside of the National Veterans Memorial Museum.
But I'd like to point out, when we talk about wellness, because we have some transition talks coming up, and we'll send that out to everyone. You guys will see it on our website and schedule. But in the book, David's very honest about that. It's not going so well for him right now. And one thing I think that, Beau, you've captured in all these photographs is just these people all connected because they're veterans, but their natural state now. The two sisters, the one that's a mom is crossing her arms, the other one is still in her uniform. And this is how, I think we may have even had a little joke about this, but how if David's mom's was I can't believe, David, you let them take that picture of you. But this is who David is right now. This is who David is after serving and being back in Ohio. And he's admittedly struggling with stuff right now. So, and I know Dan and Tom and everyone is kind of supported David, but when we talk about wellness, it's about, the physical well-being, but also your mental well-being as well, which we'll talk about a little bit. But I just want to put that out about David, because I know that was your first photograph that you took, and it was one that we wanted to make sure we included.
And that was that's Tom's favorite portrait that I took, because I think it's just, like Andy was saying, the authenticity of the moment. He was outside taking a cigarette break, but it's just so natural. And I want to keep that with every veteran in here. I didn't want to stage them with lighting. I didn't want to have makeup. I didn't want to have assistants. I wanted to just meet up with them for a short hour or two and take their portrait, which was natural to them. Because if you're like me, I don't like having my photo taken. Most people don't. So when you have a camera around, they just get a little bit more frozen. The faster you can take the photo, it's just a lot easier for everyone. But that's kind of the first part that we're talking about with transition. I would say, those 3 veterans of those 4, I would say just all have that really true story of transition and where their lives have taken them. And now, like Andy said, if we get into wellness, for most people that know the veteran space, Tim Kennedy. He's by far probably the A-list celebrity veteran in the book that we have. We want to make sure that when we were creating this book that wasn't the theme. I believe that when we were first talking about it, there was the idea of you got to get all these bigger guys, these celebrities, these big veterans, but we knew that would only cater to a certain demographic of people. So I would say 95% of the book that we have are people like you and I. We only have about 5 veterans in the book, I think maybe 4 or 5, that are known celebrities in their space or actors in Hollywood. Tim Kennedy, when Dan and I, so Dan wanted to go on this trip with me, obviously to meet Tim, and Tim was kind of chatting with us about doing a workout. He's in his full gi. He teaches Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He does it every day if you follow his Instagram. But he's just a brilliant guy. He owns 5 businesses. And when we met in Texas, Dan and I went out there and we both wanted to work out with Tim, but I had to have the camera. So I was kind of following around, and Dan, I'll say he hasn't worked out for a few years at that point, threw up within 20 minutes. Like basically Tim kind of drove him into the ground, and he was sneaky. He kind of went off to the bathroom and got sick and then told me, but it was just interesting to watch him work out with his main group of guys and then roll around on the mats. And afterwards, I basically told him, I want to take your photo when you're done with everything, because I want to get just his messy hair, the sweat, and everything that really tells who he is. And I think like that portrait is just honestly who Tim is. If you look at his Instagram or his social media, you'll see on his videos, he's just as charismatic as that smile that he has there. And if we kind of move on down towards the end here, so Steve Forty on the far left, one of probably the most brilliant people that I've personally had the pleasure of meeting. He's come to the event, the 2 events that we've had, but he has worked for Hospital of Special Surgery. So he was a Army Green Beret, and when he got out, he kind of had a very tough transition like most veterans did. But he had a background of being a medic in the Army, that when he got out, he actually was called during 2020 and was one of the very first COVID units that popped up in Greenwich, Connecticut. Mm-hmm. So they assigned him as a director, and basically he had to build up all these tents and have all the first people that had COVID go in there, and that's when they were doing all the testing and everything. But a brilliant guy that constantly talks about how not only important, eating right, keeping your body healthy, keeping your mental state, but how important, I remember him telling me this, of like your sleeping patterns. He was basically talking about how we don't focus enough on how much we're sleeping, how much we're taking care of ourselves. We only focus on, the PTSD aspect of things, but there's also, the post-traumatic growth. And I think there's a lot to be said within that I feel like throw around the PTSD term very loosely nowadays, and it is a real issue. But I think that if we focus on more of the positive and the good outside of that, of how we can build each other up, we're not just going to kind of fall victim of that. And this was actually, the funny thing about this photo too is that, I don't know if you can see, that's like a wooden backyard fence. This is like on the back patio of his home. But I wanted to focus on capturing it with a very shallow depth of field to kind of blur out everything and just capture the details in his face. I have him looking away from me. And sometimes with these veterans, I didn't really stage them. They kind of just did their own thing. And I wanted to naturally not force them to do anything different. And I believe where he was looking is he was watching Dan
closing his slide.
And that's when I captured it. So again, details that probably aren't that interesting to hear about, but I want to continue to drive home the message that we want to capture things authentically as possible with each of these veterans. If we move down just one more to Sophie Hilaire. Sophie is, if you guys have ever seen or heard Chris Farley, the comedian of the fat guy that lives in a van down by the river, that's what Sophie does for a living. Sophie is probably one of the most accomplished people at her age that I've met. She has hiked Mount Everest. She has done all the 10 tallest 14,000 peaks that you have to climb before you can do Mount Everest. And she's only, I think, 34, 35 years old. Mm-hmm. She worked for McKinsey, which is a huge company in the United States. And then she bought a Sprinter van during 2020 and kind of built it out with a lot of people that are doing now. And I had no intention of meeting Sophie, but Dan called me up one night when I was staying in Moab, Utah, which is where this photo was taken. And I was just about to go to sleep, and he gave me a call, and he's like, hey, I've got this, awesome girl I just talked to on the phone who was introduced by the sisters, and you got to meet her. I don't know where she's at, but she said she's somewhere in Utah. So I was like, okay, fair enough. It's not that far. I can figure it out. So I called her up, and she's like, oh, I'm about 30 minutes from Moab, Utah. So I was like, that's a really small world. That's a crazy kind of story that you're going to be in the same area as me. Do you need a hot shower? I know you're living in your van. You can use my hotel room for the night. And so we actually agreed to meet the next morning at sunrise before I had to get on the road to Colorado. But I captured that just before the sun rose, and I want to capture her inside of her van there. And that's probably I would say, to wrap up the wellness. And now if we get into leadership, we'll kind of finish on this wall.
And that van, now famously in this picture, Sophie did show up to the opening of the exhibition last month.
Yes.
And I walked her out to her car, and she got in the van, and I don't know where she was going next, but she came to Columbus for this.
She named her van Sage.
Okay.
So that's the name of the van, and she's kind of one of those people that I believe now she is looking at moving to Georgia. So she's like kind of established some land and all that. But just to have that kind of lifestyle, to be, this kind of powerful woman, be alone out in the wilderness, to live off the land, to climb Mount Everest, to work for some of the biggest, company in the United States. She's done a lot for her age. And I think that speaks volumes to a lot of veterans and people who aren't veterans, that we can really do a lot. I'll talk more about it later, but for those of you that are interested in film, that's all I shoot on. I don't shoot on digital. I only have 10 shots per roll of film. It's very expensive to develop. It's basically a platform from the 70s and 80s that I still shoot on.
Doesn't that tie into our final
It'll tie into
portrait?
the final one, yeah.
Ironic.
Yep. So if we go over here, the two that I mainly want to highlight on this wall would be the second portrait. So J.C. Glick. J.C. was one of the very first veterans that basically signed up on our idea of this book. He helped connect us in a lot of ways to all the veterans that are featured in this book. He also worked alongside Tanya Oxendine for MVP, Emerging Vets and Players, and has gone on to other companies, but is just an incredible person. I met with JC in Long Island, again in January, and I had this joke because JC and I were talking about YouTube videos of people doing these like polar plunges, like jumping in the freezing cold Atlantic Ocean. And he's like, yeah, I just did one like a month ago. And so I brought the idea, I said, well, let's do one tomorrow morning before we leave. And Dan and Tom are with me on this trip. And sure enough, I think Dan and Tom agreed to it, but when I woke them up at 5:30 in the morning in the hotel, they were like, we're really gonna do this. And so we went out there, and Tom still blames me that I was able to persuade 3 Army Rangers to jump in the freezing cold. And we got like in our underwear, jumped in, came out. And I took that photo like right after we went back to his house. He showered and all that. But that was just in front of his house.
But no photos of the plunge, right?
No,
Okay.
None of that. I wish we had someone there, but he's just an incredible person. And again, I can't stress enough how unique all these stories are. But for JC to connect us to all the veterans that have even come and visited the museum, he's doing a lot. And I know that we want to continue to do work with him here in this space and even more in the future. Mm-hmm. And last, the father and son here. So the left is Andrew Thetford. On the right is William, or most people know him as Bill Thetford. Bill is quite accomplished in the military. For those of you that know, some of the top tier 1 special operations, the unit he served in for quite a majority of his time. And his son was actually fortunate enough to do a mission with him. They served, I believe, they were on different forward operating bases. And when Andrew knew that his dad wasn't too far away in Afghanistan, basically, Bill made the call and had his son transfer over for a couple days to visit his dad. And they had about 6 or 7 Navy SEALs at the time that brought them on and thought it was a cool idea to have a father and son to do a raid and do a mission together. And there's a photo of them in the book of them after that raid, just kitted out and everything. But the funny story about these two is because I'm shooting on film, Dan and I met with them again near Fort Bragg in North Carolina where they live. And out of the 10 shots that I have per roll, I needed to take 3 photos of these two gentlemen, and I had 3 photos left, and I didn't have any more rolls of film. So I kind of kept it secret, but when we got there, I told Dan. He said, how much film did you bring? And I said, well, I have 3 shots. And he's like, don't we need 3 shots? And I said, yeah. And he's like, Beau, are you kidding me? I was like, no, we'll get it. We'll be fine. So I guess funny story between Dan and I, but I focused on photographing them independently and then this photo of them together. So if you get a chance, if you haven't already picked up a book or you want to take a look at it, it's on the table, you'll see they have 2 different pages of independently, and then you'll see the photo of them together as well. And it has like a combined story of them. But to talk about leadership, I mean, to see a father and son that have served together, to see what lessons, his father has taught him going forward and where Andrew's life has taken him, it was an interesting perspective to see an accomplished officer as Bill himself, where his son you would almost think he's kind of following the coattails of his father. Mm-hmm. Always wanted to do more missions, wanted to serve more, wanted to become special operations, never got a chance to do it, but has done even better things with his life and still, honors his father and what his dad has been through overseas. I think was an important story to tell. And again, going into creating this book and the exhibit, we didn't have an idea that we'd even meet a father and son or 2 sisters or a husband and wife. And so that was kind of the unique thing of capturing these people together and telling their story independently and both together as well.
I've got one final question to wrap up. We spent a couple weeks going through the subtitle of this exhibition about it's the 20-year war, our next greatest generation. And it could be considered controversial because the connotation of the greatest generation is normally associated with World War II and the massive amount of people that surrounded that time period.
Yes.
But we went back and forth, and you guys were pretty steadfast. Like, we think this is the title of what this exhibition should be. Mm-hmm. So, and I've heard it from Tom and Dan, but I know you've been on a lot of those phone calls. But I just, for everyone here, what, in your mind, what makes this generation the next greatest generation of veterans who served during the last 20 years?
So I've probably elaborated in some context through this discussion tonight of why we titled it Our Next Greatest Generation, but I truly believe that, whether you're a veteran or you're a civilian, I mean, we're living right now. This generation is what's going to carry the next generation forward. So we came up with that bold statement, I'll say, because we wanted to strike a chord. We wanted people to look at it and see, like, wow, like, well, what are they doing that's so great? And if you look at all 20 of these portraits and the 71 that are in the book and you read about their lives and where it's taken them, they're doing a lot of great things in their community. They've started up successful businesses that have employed thousands of people. They have charities that are benefiting other veterans or other people in their workforce. They're doing workouts to help people improve physically and mentally. So when I look at what is going to be our next greatest generation, it's those kind of people that I want to surround myself with. The people that are going to help raise our future generation of children, that are going to be there in times where right now, I truly believe that we are such a divided nation with everything going on, with the distractions of our phones, with social media, with the news, with everything that we're being force-fed. We can't really allow ourselves to understand each other anymore. And the conversation that I would almost argue is the last time that we were really united was 9/11. If we really think about that singular moment where we all came together as a nation, was that time. So going forward from that, I truly believe that our next greatest generation are the men and women that have served our country and that are continuing to serve our community now.